All right, welcome to the last of my kind of marathon videos today, trying to bring you up to speed on the meaning of Protestant theology. When I was in graduate school and doing my comprehensive exams on the Trinity and early Christian theology, my instructors gave me a variety of questions to answer on my comprehensive exams. Some I could use, some I didn't. And one of the ones they asked me was, what religion did Augustine convert to, and what religion did Augustine convert from? Now, I didn't answer that question because I didn't really understand it at the time. Had I read this book, I would have been able to give a really good answer to it. Actually, I was cut and paste this book, which you can't do. But this book really helps you understand that, because this chapter really helps you understand that, because this chapter is all about how Augustine conceived of Christ the mediator. Now, I haven't been succeeding in getting under 5 minutes. We're going to try again. Maybe these will get shorter. But here's the central premise is that Augustine fit the notion of Christian salvation into Platonist spirituality rather than understanding Platonist spirituality in the context of the gospel. So instead of the gospel giving him this framework for appropriating and learning what he could from Plato, he stuck the gospel into Plato and understood it on those terms. So let me start with where Cary says this. Augustine endorses in no uncertain terms the Platonist notion of intellectual vision, which, by the way, remember we said was the ability of the mind to contemplate the eternal ideas or the eternal forms of ideas. Augustine endorses the Platonist notion of intellectual vision, which he used to define the ultimate goal of the human life and therefore of Christian faith. We all want to be happy, and for Augustine, this means that what we ultimately want is not mere bodily pleasure or even personal relationships, but to see the intelligible light of the mind. That is, to know God is to know the eternal light, the changeless light. And so the goal of the gospel is to help us get to this place where we understand the changeless light. So to understand what we mean by light here, we do mean something impersonal. He goes on. True happiness for Augustine is not, quote, not like the mind enjoying the body or itself, nor is it like a friend enjoying a friend. It is like the eye enjoying light. So true happiness, the goal, what becomes in the Christian tradition called the beatific vision, the vision that makes you happy, is the seeing of the unseen God, seeing the one who dwells in light inaccessible. Now, part of this goes back from taking from Augustine, from Platonist spirituality, the truth that God can be understood as unchanging, eternal goodness and justice and truth. And taking from that and saying, well, the goal of is to understand, we can only understand these shadowy reflections of truth and goodness and justice. But the goal of the Christian life is to get us to the place where we get to see with our minds, not with our eyes, it's a metaphor, with our minds the true goodness and beauty of God. But okay, well, how exactly does an immutable being, a key here is that the eternal changeless form is immutable. It cannot change. It does not change. It eternally is what it is. It's not bound by time and change and all this nasty stuff that we are. Well, how exactly does an immutable being make himself or make itself, because it's immutable, it's less personal than you might think, known to mutable beings like us who are bound to mutable beings? And so the recognition here is that Augustine adopts the hierarchy of being, that there's the eternal light inaccessible, and then there's these shades of being that are more and more changeable, all the way down to human beings who are ultimately changeable. And we as human beings are stuck. I don't know if you can hear my daughter crying, but there you go. Sorry. We're stuck because we see only material things. And here Augustine brings in the notion of sin as idolatry. We are prone to mistake those material things that we see for the end, the goal. But no material thing can be the end or the goal. It always has to be the means of seeing the light inaccessible. And so the problem is that our hearts are contaminated and corrupt. And so we always want to mistake something changeable and corruptible and call it a god and call it immaterial and incorruptible. So this is what idolatry is, right? We take gold and we make a statue and we bow down to it, or we take money or sex or power. We take some material thing and we say, that's really what we're going after. And instead of saying, no, this is something to be used for the sake of God, enjoying God, who alone is to be enjoyed. So this is a big distinction for Augustine, using everything that is transient and temporal and physical for the sake of the ultimate good, which is enjoyment of God. So, okay, well, how exactly does Christ help us with this? Because you need the key idea here is that you need a mediator between the changeless eternal being and us who are bound by time. And here, this is where Christ comes into the picture. He becomes the mediator between the eternal unchangeable light. The eternal unchangeable light takes on human flesh so he can interact with humans. All right, so going back to Plato's cave analogy, think of it this way. In Plato's cave, you're bound and you can only see shadows. So the God becomes a shadow so that the shadow can walk us, who can only see shadows, out of the cave to where we can see God himself. All right. And so this is the idea of what faith and words are for Augustine. That is, God sends Jesus to take on human flesh so that he can interact with us as material beings and then set us on the right road. He makes a big deal out of Augustine's use of the term the way, or, the John 14 says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So Augustine takes the idea that Christ is the way. So Christ is the way that we get to the beatific vision, the vision of light inaccessible, or the light eternal and unchanging. And faith is the way we start on this, because we hear the words of Christ and the words of Scripture that are an authoritative word that because we are bound to material things, we have to take on faith and trust. Okay, that's the truth, and I got to follow that to get out of my bondage to corruption and my bondage to material things. And so the challenge here, though, is that Christ has become. And this leads us to the idea of faith-seeking understanding. This is a famous phrase in the Christian tradition, and Cary argues here that Protestants misunderstand Augustine's use of this, because for Augustine, faith-seeking understanding what meant that faith is is how God gets down onto your level and grabs your shadow-bound attention and then leads you to something higher and better, which is understanding, or intellectual vision, sight. So the goal is to rise above Christ's humanity, to rise above even the words themselves, to understand God as he is in his changelessness, above all material representations and objects. So here, Christ becomes a teacher. He becomes the way, just like I might tell you the angles of a triangle all add up to 180 degrees. You can take my word for it if I were a math teacher, and you should if I were a math teacher. I'm not a math teacher. But if you were talking to a math teacher, there's one stage where you take their word for it, right? And they tell you a formula by which you can calculate this, and you take their word for it. But then, as a good math student, you would develop to the point where you can figure that out for yourself, and you can see it in your mind based on the way triangles work, right? So your teacher's there is a help, but you don't actually need the teacher forever. Your goal is to rise above the teacher. The goal, you first trust their authority until you can figure out how to think through it for yourself. And Cary's argument here is that that's how Augustine ultimately puts Christ. Christ is the one who comes down to our level to guide us up and out, but ultimately it leads us to the place where Christ becomes a means to an end of enjoying God, but he's not the end himself. Where Christ is not the end himself because he's a material being, and material beings can't be the end itself. So in other words, Christ has become a shadow in our cave to lead us out of the cave so that we can see God as he is when he's not a shadow. And that argument that Cary's going to make is that the whole cave analogy is more like the sun itself has come into the cave to show us that we're not actually in a cave, to show us that we actually are where we were created to be, but it's been corrupted in another way. So let me read what Cary says. The problem with Augustine's conception of Christ the mediator is that it makes Christ's humanity, his humanness, our way to God rather than God's way to us. It's about how we change in order to come to God rather than how God in Christ comes to us, changes us, and makes all things new. So he thinks Augustine made a misstep here, and he put Christ as a means to an end rather than the way that we know God. And he kind of says this is the difference between Eastern Christianity and the Orthodox tradition and the Western Christianity. Is the Eastern Christianity said you know the glory of God in the face of Jesus. You cannot know the glory of God apart from the face of Jesus. Whereas Western Christianity didn't quite hold on to that in the same way. And now this is like a long chapter, it's very dense, and I'm already at 10 minutes because I'm failing utterly at doing the whole 5-minute thing. That may have been a bad plan. Well, let's close up with this, because here's where he's going, and when he's going to round out this section in the next chapter called the Augustinian Journey and its Anxieties. And here's where he's going. Here's the thing. If faith is merely putting us on the right road by trusting the guy who's going to lead us out of the shadows, if faith merely puts us on the right road, heeding the signs that point in the direction of real knowledge of God, which consists in understanding, intellectual vision, the seeking, how do we move along this road? How do we move along the road that is Christ? The seeking that moves us along the road to understanding is not faith, but love. That is, wanting what's at the end of the road. Faith accepts that this is the road, but love is what pulls us down the road to the thing that we really want. And so Protestants, when we say faith-seeking understanding, and we think of it as faith understands some things that reason can't quite get to, that's not how Augustine understood it. Faith is accepting that Jesus is the way to something that I can eventually, to some other end, to knowing God apart from Jesus, to knowing God apart from the flesh and words of God. So here's where he kind of sums up. A properly Augustinian interpretation of faith-seeking understanding must insist on the point that believers seek understanding by love, not by faith alone. For Augustine, faith alone could only mean faith at the beginning of the road, devoid of understanding and not yet seeking it. So Augustine says, love understanding, love it a lot. So here we can see where the Protestant tradition divides from the Catholic tradition, which kind of insists in faith and love, because Catholics stayed better Augustinians and Protestants separated from Augustine. So that brings you up to speed. Hopefully in the future, I can get these under 5 minutes. Thanks for watching.